September 20th, 1932. 11 iron workers sit on a bare steel beam 850 feet above Manhattan, eating lunch like it is a park bench. No nets, no harnesses. The question everyone asks is how they were not terrified. But the harder question is this. Safety belts existed on this job site. Foremen offered them, and the beam walkers at Rockefeller Center refused. Not out of ignorance, not out of bravado, they refused because strapping into a belt 850 feet up could get you killed faster than working without one. At the height of the Depression, on the largest private construction project New York had ever seen, that choice followed a brutal, practical logic that's been buried under the legend ever since. Refusing a safety belt on the beams of Rockefeller Center was not a reckless dare, but a decision shaped by the realities of high steel work in 1932. At a time when safety belts were available on many New York skyscraper sites, iron workers still turned them down in large numbers. The question isn't why they ignored the rules, but why the rules seemed so out of step with the job itself. For these men, the belt was more than a piece of equipment, it was a trade-off. Strapping in could mean losing the balance and freedom of movement that kept them alive on a narrow flange, hundreds of feet above the city. If a gust of wind or a sudden slip demanded a quick sidestep, a tangled belt could spell disaster. The pace of the work allowed little room for hesitation. Piece rate pay meant every second counted. Anything that slowed a riveter's swing or a connector's reach cut directly into a day's wages. Crude trust and practiced routines mattered more than any line or harness. The men relied on each other's skill and rhythm, not on a strip of canvas or a steel cable. The famous lunch photo, staged as part of a publicity campaign, only deepened the mystery. It captured a real risk, but also a carefully orchestrated moment, one that blurred the line between myth and reality. The absence of belts in that image was no accident. It was a reflection of the trade's unwritten code. Today, with modern harnesses and strict regulations, the old ways seem reckless. But in the world of Depression-era ironwork, refusing the belt was a calculated, if costly, choice. A choice that shaped the skyline and the legend of those who built it. In the heart of the Great Depression, Rockefeller Center rose from Midtown Manhattan as a private gamble on the future. Spread across 22 acres, the project was unlike anything the city had seen. 19 buildings, a new plaza, theaters, radio studios, shops, and offices, all funded by the Rockefeller family at a moment when banks were collapsing and bread lines stretched around city blocks. Construction began in May 1930, and over the next decade, more than 40,000 men found work on the site. For many, this was the only steady job available in a city where unemployment hovered near 25%. The scale alone was staggering. The RCA building, later known as 30 Rockefeller Plaza, topped out at 850 feet in September 1932, its steel skeleton climbing above a city still reeling from economic disaster. Contractors ordered steel by the mile, poured concrete by the acre, and kept the site running day and night. Each new floor meant another round of hiring, another chance for men to bring home a paycheck that might cover rent and groceries for their families. Press coverage at the time cast Rockefeller Center as a beacon of hope, a sign that private money and American willpower could defy the gloom of the era. But behind the headlines, the mood among workers was more complicated. The promise of a job came with constant risk. The men who signed on as iron workers knew that every day on the beams meant a brush with death. Still, the alternative was hunger or eviction. For recent immigrants and Mohawk laborers from Kanawake, the project offered a rare path to steady wages, even if the price was measured in danger. The center's ambition was both a monument to confidence and a survival strategy for thousands. Each paycheck depended on speed, precision, and the ability to keep moving, no matter how high the steel climbed. Piece rate pay meant that every second lost to hesitation or to the drag of a safety belt could mean less money at the end of the week. In this world, the grandeur of the buildings above ground was matched by the grind of necessity below. Rockefeller Center became both a symbol of New York's resilience and a crucible where labor, risk, and hope were welded together, one beam at a time. High above the city, the men who walked the beams of Rockefeller Center belonged to a world apart. Among them, Mohawk ironworkers from Kanawake had earned a reputation that stretched back decades. Their families had crossed the border from Quebec since the 1880s, drawn to New York's rising skyline by a trade that demanded steady nerves and sure feet. They called themselves skywalkers, and their presence on the city's tallest frames became almost legendary. Generations learned to read the wind, trust their balance, and rely on each other's word more than any written rule. Alongside them worked recent immigrants from Ireland, Italy, Poland, and beyond, men who had crossed oceans in search of work that paid enough to keep their families housed and fed. The mix of languages on the beams was as varied as the city below, but a shared code bound the crews together. What set these workers apart was not a taste for danger, but a culture built on skill and mutual respect. The ability to keep moving, to stay light on the steel, counted for more than any badge or certificate. On a narrow flange, hundreds of feet up, balance was survival. Trust was currency. A misstep could cost a life, but so could hesitation. Stories from the era describe the quiet confidence of the Mohawk crews, the way they moved across the frame with a calm that others marveled at, earning them the most exposed and difficult jobs. Their legacy was not just in their fearlessness, but in the way they taught others to work safely without relying on equipment that felt clumsy or restrictive. For immigrant laborers, the willingness to walk the beams without a belt was a ticket to the best-paying shifts. It signaled to foremen and fellow workers that a man could be trusted with the hardest tasks and that he understood the rhythm of the trade. This sense of pride ran deep. Refusing the safety belt was never just bravado, it was a mark of belonging in a close-knit brotherhood where every man's life depended on the skill and attention of the crew. The culture of high steel work grew from necessity, but it also shaped an identity, one that valued courage but measured it in steady hands and watchful eyes rather than showy stunts. The myth of the daredevil ironworker has outlasted the men themselves, but their true legacy lives on in the silent discipline and trust that held each crew together. The skyline they built stands as a monument not only to their nerve, but to the quiet, practiced teamwork that made the impossible seem routine. Steelwork on Rockefeller Center played out as a kind of mid-air choreography, each movement deliberate and rehearsed. At dawn, crews assembled at street level, eyes on the weather logs, measuring wind that could turn a routine lift into a test of nerve. Steel columns and beams, each marked for its place in the rising frame, were hoisted by crane and swung into position. Connectors balanced on flanges barely wider than a boot, guiding the steel into place with practiced ease and a steady hand. Beneath them, nothing but open air. The first step was alignment. A rigger, trusted for his judgment, signaled the crane operator with a raised palm or a sharp whistle. As the steel swung overhead, terse commands cut through the morning: hold, steady, down. Precision was everything. The smallest misstep could send a beam rolling or a man scrambling for balance. Bolts were slipped in by hand, tightened with heavy wrenches while the frame still trembled from the lift. Once the skeleton was joined, riveting began. A red-hot rivet, pulled from the heater's forge, was tossed up, sometimes caught bare-handed in a rag, to the man at the hole. The gunner pressed a pneumatic rivet gun to the head, driving it home with a staccato rhythm. On the far side, a bucker braced the rivet with a heavy bar, matching the gunner's pace. The crew moved in a tight circle, each man's safety tied to the other's attention and timing. Every move was calculated for speed and efficiency. Piece rate wages demanded it. The faster the row of rivets, the more money in a worker's pocket at week's end. There was no harness to catch a slip. Early safety belts were little more than canvas strips with a steel ring, clipped to a cable strung along the beam. To a man on high steel, the belt felt like a shackle. If a gust hit or a tool was dropped, a worker needed to move fast, sometimes leaping from one beam to the next. A tangled belt could trap a man in the wrong place at the wrong time. The gear was heavy, prone to snagging on rivet guns or bolts, and often left behind. Most crews worked without nets beneath them. The only barrier between a misstep and the street was experience and nerve. Communication was nearly silent. Hand signals replaced shouting, arms raised for stop, fingers pointed for direction, a clenched fist for hold. The city's noise and the clatter of tools made words unreliable. In this environment, trust was everything. Each man watched the others, catching small slips or warnings in a glance or a shift of weight. The discipline was unspoken, but absolute. A careless move risked not just a life, but the whole crew's safety and pay. Wind was a constant adversary. Even a mild breeze could sway a column or send a lunch pail tumbling. On bad days, men tied wire around their boots for extra grip or waited out the worst gusts, perched on the steel. There were no digital wind monitors or stop work orders, only the judgment of the most seasoned hands. The workday passed in this rhythm: connect, rivet, balance, signal, move. The skyline grew floor by floor, each beam locked in place by men who trusted their bodies, their balance, and their crew more than any safety device. The famous lunch photo, staged or not, captured a truth about the job. The exposure was real, and so was the discipline that made it survivable. The men on those beams were practicing a trade that demanded constant vigilance, skill, and a kind of courage that has no easy modern equivalent. The skyline they built still stands, a monument to work that was as much about discipline and trust as it was about daring. Early safety belts on Rockefeller Center's steel frame were simple devices, closer to a lineman's waist strap than the full-body harnesses seen today. The standard kit in 1932 was a heavy canvas or leather belt, buckled tight around the waist and fitted with a single steel D-ring. This ring clipped to a lifeline, a thick steel cable or rope strung along the length of the beam. The idea was straightforward. If a man slipped, the belt and cable would keep him from plunging all the way to the street below. In practice, the system was a compromise, shaped by the limits of the era's technology and the realities of the job. Manufacturers like the Miller Safety Harness Company advertised their belts as a practical solution for high-rise work. The lifeline could be anchored at intervals along the steel frame, giving each worker a fixed point to clip in. Engineers and contractors were not blind to the danger. Internal memos and construction guides from the time show a clear awareness of the risks of falling, and many foremen tried to enforce the use of belts on critical lifts or during windy conditions. Insurance companies, too, began to pressure builders to adopt any available safety measures, hoping to limit costly claims from fatal accidents. But the belt's design reflected a world still learning how to protect workers at height. The waist strap offered little support in the event of a real fall. Unlike modern harnesses, it did not distribute force across the body. A sudden stop could wrench a man's back or crush his ribs. The attachment point, usually a carabiner or snap hook, had to be fastened and unfastened by hand every time a worker moved. On a busy beam, where men shifted position constantly, this meant the belt was often left unclipped or dragged behind, more a token of compliance than a reliable safeguard. Lifeline itself posed its own problems. It could only be installed where the frame allowed, and on a rising skeleton of steel, anchor points were often temporary or improvised. The cable might run along one side of the beam, leaving a worker exposed if he needed to cross to the other. In the rush of piece rate work, with crews racing to meet quotas, the belt's promise of safety was always weighed against its potential to slow the job or get in the way. Still, the presence of these early belts on site shows that the era was not indifferent to risk. The equipment was there, a sign that both employers and engineers recognized the stakes. But the design and deployment of the gear, limited, awkward, and sometimes more hazard than help, revealed the gap between intention and reality. The safety belt of 1932 was a step toward protection, but only a partial one, shaped as much by what the job demanded as by what technology could deliver. On the beams of Rockefeller Center, the decision to leave the safety belt behind was not just about bravado, it was a calculation shaped by the work itself. The steel frame was a living thing, shifting and swaying with every crane lift and gust of wind. For a riveter, every movement counted. The superintendent's own memo from June 1932 spelled it out. Belts impeded the riveter's reach and delayed the frame's erection. In a trade where speed and precision meant a full paycheck, anything that slowed a man down was a threat to his livelihood. The belts of the era were heavy and stiff, cinched tight around the waist with a steel ring clipped to a cable. But the cable only ran where the frame allowed, and the work demanded constant motion, sidestepping, crouching, stretching to catch a tossed rivet or to dodge a falling tool. A belt could snag on a rivet gun, catch on a bolt, or even pin a worker against the steel if the wind shifted suddenly. The risk was not just theoretical. Accident reports from the time describe belts tangling at the worst possible moment, turning a slip into a stumble or a stumble into a fall. The idea of protection became, in practice, a new source of danger. Red Mo Lunop, a well-known figure among the crews, put it plainly in his 1935 letter. If you're clipped in and the steel moves, you have to move with it, or you risk being yanked off balance. The belt, he said, made you slower and less sure. On a bare beam, a man could adjust in an instant, shifting his weight, swinging his body clear. Strapped in, he lost that edge. Mo's words echoed through the trade. The belt catches, and you can't move with the steel. It's a simple line, but it captures the logic that governed the job. Survival depended on instinct and speed, not on a piece of gear that might hold you back at the worst moment. The pace of work was relentless. Piece rate pay meant that every extra second spent unclipping, reattaching, or untangling a belt was money lost. Crews relied on each other, not on equipment. Trust ran deep. Each man's safety was bound to the rhythm and awareness of the crew, not to a cable running along the beam. The belt became a symbol of hesitation, a mark that a man didn't trust his own balance or the crew's watchfulness. For some, refusing it was a point of pride, a badge of belonging among the best. For others, it was simple necessity. A slow worker risked being replaced, and a man who fumbled with his gear could cost the whole crew. The famous lunch photo, staged as it was, captured more than just a publicity stunt. It condensed a whole world of trade logic and lived experience into a single image. The men seated on the beam without belts weren't just posing, they were showing the reality of their work, shaped by the tools they trusted and the risks they weighed every day. Today, modern harnesses spread the force of a fall, self-retracting lifelines move with the worker, and safety is written into every contract. But in 1932, the belt was a compromise that didn't fit the job. The refusal was not madness, but a reasoned response to the demands of high steel. Looking back, it's easy to see only the danger and wonder how anyone could take such a risk. But for the men who built the skyline, the choice was clear. Trust your balance, trust your crew, and keep moving. The skyline still stands as proof, not just of daring, but of the hard, unsentimental logic that shaped every decision on the beam. Among the men who built Rockefeller Center, the unwritten code of the trade mattered as much as any blueprint. To walk the steel without a belt was more than habit. It was a declaration of belonging. In the eyes of the crew, nerve and composure had real weight. A man who could balance on a 6-inch flange, steady and unflinching in the wind, earned respect not by boasting, but by proving himself day after day. This steadiness under pressure became a kind of social currency, traded in glances and quiet nods. It separated those who merely showed up from those who were trusted with the hardest jobs. Newcomers had to earn their place. No amount of talk could substitute for performance on the beam. Crews watched for hesitation, for the way a man moved when the frame shivered or a rivet gun jammed. Slipping into a belt was read as a sign of uncertainty, a subtle admission that a worker might not trust his own balance or the hands of the men beside him. Among Mohawk iron workers and seasoned immigrants alike, the expectation was clear. Skill and calm kept you safe, not just for your own sake, but for the whole crew. If one man faltered, everyone was at risk. This code normalized danger, making exposure a badge of mastery rather than a mark of recklessness. Refusing the belt was not an act of bravado for its own sake. It was the price of full acceptance. The legendary lunch photo, staged though it was, captured this reality. The men on the beam were not performing for the camera. They were showing the world what counted in their trade. Today's safety standards would see their choices as unthinkable. But on those beams, trust, pride, and the hard-earned confidence of the crew shaped every step. The skyline that rose from their labor still carries the imprint of that code, written in steel and memory. Piece rate pay turned every hour on the beams into a race against the clock. For iron workers in Depression-era New York, speed was not just a point of pride, but a matter of survival. The work was paid by the beam, by the rivet, not by the hour. A man's earnings depended on how quickly he could move, how many lengths of steel he could help set before the whistle blew. Bill Pitt Boucher, who rented a room in Queens for $12 a month, remembered refusing a foreman's offer of steady hourly pay. He knew the arithmetic. The piece rate, though risky, offered a shot at covering rent, groceries, and the cost of keeping his family afloat when most of the city was out of work. The pressure was relentless. Any tool or rule that slowed a man down meant less food on the table. Safety belts, for all their promise, could tangle, catch, or force a worker to unclip and reclip dozens of times in a single shift. Each pause chipped away at the paycheck. In the lean years of the early 1930s, a missed day's wages might mean missing rent altogether. The reality of this economic squeeze came into sharp focus in September 1935 at a local 3-union meeting in Kanawake. Chief Joseph Joe T. Morrison led negotiations that tied the traditional belt-free practice to a stricter piece rate schedule. The union pushed for higher pay per rivet, arguing that mandatory belts would slow the job and threaten the wage premium that allowed Mohawk families to send money home. Contractors facing rising insurance costs wanted uniform safety rules. The compromise, lifelines on the highest floors, but the freedom to work belt-free where crews judged the risk manageable. In the end, necessity and pride shaped the deal as much as any written contract. The men's refusal to slow down was not bravado. It was the logic of survival, sharpened by the hard math of the Depression. Falls from the beams were a recurring fact of life for the men who built Rockefeller Center. Newspapers rarely named the dead, and union ledgers kept quiet tallies of men who never came home. In the early 1930s, high steel construction in New York City claimed an average of a dozen lives each year. 6 men died during the raising of Rockefeller Center's frame, most from falls, some from snapped cables or shifting steel. There were no memorials, only a line in the payroll or a brief mention in the back pages of the Times. Red Mo Lunop's death in 1936 stands as one of the few that made print. The obituary, buried deep in the paper, described a young man who fell 800 feet from the RCA building. His belt failed, but the story that survived among his peers was simpler. He had always said the belt slowed him down, that it made him less sure on the steel. The loss was not treated as legend, but as a warning. Crews paused, remembered, and returned to the beams. For every myth of the fearless ironworker, there were families left behind and pay envelopes that stopped arriving. Skill and nerve could not erase the risk. The men were admired for their balance and composure, but they were not superhuman. Each fall was a reminder that the city's skyline was built at a cost measured in more than steel and stone. The stories that endure are not just of daring, but of the quiet toll exacted by a job where a single misstep could end a life. The legend of the beam walkers is inseparable from the reality of loss. That reality shaped the trade as much as any code of pride or skill. On September 20, 1932, a press release from Rockefeller Center announced a milestone. The steel of the RCA building had reached 850 feet. The news was timed to land with a photograph that would soon become iconic. 11 men side by side eating lunch on a narrow beam suspended above Manhattan. But this was no spontaneous lunch break. The scene was assembled with care, each worker positioned for the camera, the city falling away beneath them. The goal was clear: to show the world a crew of fearless American workers, undaunted by height or hardship, building hope in the depths of the Depression. Publicity managers at Rockefeller Center understood the power of spectacle. The staged lunch scene was part of a broader campaign to recast the project as a symbol of resilience and progress. The image was released to newspapers and quickly spread, offering a vision of camaraderie and daring at a time when the nation needed both. Reporters and photographers blurred the line between documentation and promotion, turning the daily risks of high steel work into a kind of legend. The men on the beam were real iron workers, their nerves and balance hard-earned. The danger was not invented. But the photograph itself was crafted to amplify a myth, the idea that these men, and by extension the city, were unbreakable. The absence of safety belts in the image was no oversight. It was a deliberate choice that spoke to the culture of the trade and the story Rockefeller Center wanted to tell. Even as the photo became a symbol, it preserved a truth about the era. Courage and risk were inseparable on the skyline, and the memory of those who built it was shaped as much by image makers as by the men themselves. The world of high steel has changed almost beyond recognition since the days when iron workers weighed every belt and lifeline against their own skill and the rhythm of the crew. Today, the very idea of stepping onto a beam without fall protection is unthinkable. Modern construction sites are governed by rules that would have seemed alien in 1932. Full-body harnesses, engineered anchor points, and safety nets are standard equipment. These harnesses distribute the force of a fall across the body, reducing the risk of serious injury, while self-retracting lifelines allow a worker to move freely but lock instantly if a slip occurs. Safety nets, first introduced on bridge projects in the 1930s and later adopted for skyscrapers, catch workers who lose their footing, turning what would have been a fatal drop into a survivable scare. The transformation did not happen overnight. For decades, the industry relied on the old calculus of nerve, balance, and crew trust. Accidents and fatalities were accepted as the cost of progress. But as the toll mounted, pressure grew from new directions. Labor unions began to demand better conditions, not just higher pay, but real protection. Insurance companies, facing mounting claims, raised premiums and threatened to pull coverage unless contractors adopted safer practices. Engineers responded with new designs, lighter, more effective harnesses, stronger anchor points, and nets that could be deployed quickly as the building rose. The legal landscape shifted as well. In 1970, the Occupational Safety and Health Act established federal authority to set and enforce workplace safety standards. OSHA rules made fall protection mandatory for any work more than 6 feet above the ground. Employers became responsible for providing harnesses, training, and the authority for any worker to halt a job they believed was unsafe. Modern safety culture rests on the principle that no paycheck is worth a life. Stop work authority, toolbox talks, digital wind monitors. These are now part of the daily routine on high-rise sites. The results are stark. Fall fatalities on steel frames have dropped by more than 90% since the 1970s. What was once considered a mark of pride, working untethered, trusting only your balance, has been replaced by a shared expectation of protection. The trade's old code has not disappeared, but it now lives alongside a new ethic. Skill and courage are still honored, but no longer at the expense of safety. The skyline continues to rise, built by hands that move with confidence, but also with the assurance that the risks are managed, not simply endured. The era of the belt-free beam walker is gone, but the lessons of that world, its pride, its losses, its hard-won progress, remain written in steel and memory. Today's towers rise with harnesses, nets, and strict codes, yet the city's bones were set by men for whom risk was a calculation, not a dare. The staged photograph blurs myth and reality, but the true story is in the choices made under pressure and pride. Every skyline is a ledger of lives balanced against necessity. The courage wasn't in ignoring danger, it was in mastering it. Next time you look up, remember who held the line.